Hello and welcome to this video where we're taking a look at Cubase 13's Vocoder plugin. So this is something which hasn't been around for quite a while if I recall correctly, but certainly this is a reasonably useful vocoder. So if you're not aware, a vocoder is effectively a set of filters that pass one signal through them, but the volume of each of those filters is controlled by another signal. And this allows you to mix a sound together in a way which wouldn't normally be possible. And generally, depending on the two audio signals that you choose, you can effectively end up often with either a synthesizer which sounds like a voice or some rather more interesting sounds. So the typical use for it, and the one which a lot of people know, is you have a vocal and then you play a synthesizer, so you're playing the voice, and there are enough frequencies in the voice to play pretty much any note. So what I've got set up here is something similar, but fortunately you will avoid my singing. And I'm just going to turn the vocoder off. This is just a free sample which I downloaded. Because I'll be honest, most vocal samples I find I generally get annoyed with and just bored of after about 30 seconds. So this is at least a little bit different. It's just that same thing repeated. The vocoder is an audio effect. So as you can see here in the insert section, I've got the vocoder and here it is. It's pretty standard for the most part. There's a few nice features which we're going to take a look at, but we'll just take a general run through some of the presets and then look at some of the features. So what I've got here is a MIDI track. So this is just a normal MIDI track. It's controlled by my keyboard, which when I play it, the MIDI here is going out to our vocoder. So we can see it's going to the vocoder in, the MIDI in. So we've got this insert vocoder and then the MIDI is being fed to it. If you don't feed MIDI to it, by default, fortunately, it's in a fixed mode. So it's basically fixed to a C. So if you just load the vocoder up, it's more friendly than many vocoders, which is a bit of a turn up for Steinberg. So if you play it, you'll hear that effectively a C. So the MIDI here is fixed, C3. You can change it to a different octave. Or you can pick a different note. And you could just play it like that and go through those presets. However, we'll not be doing that. We're just going to set it to external. So now when I play, nothing happens until I play a note on the keyboard. And you can hear that. So that's pretty much how this works. Now we'll go through all these controls. But first, a few of the presets. So there are 20 presets, which is reasonable for a vocoder because there's a finite amount of settings, and a couple of them pick up on some interesting parts of here. The classic sort of talking sound, Bell Labs 1936. So this sounds like the classic talking sound you'd expected from, you know, the Voda, etc., that kind of thing. Intimidating robot voice is a little harsher than the previous one. And unpleasant announcement is one of the ones that I thought was worth having a listen to. Yes, it's got quite a LFO sound. So again, that's making a bit more interesting use of the controls rather than them just taking you through tiny variations of the same old sound again and again. So they're certainly worth an explore. I think you'll find, 10 minutes worth of work listening to all of those will be worth your time. So now we're going to take a look at some of these controls and hopefully understand a bit more about the vocoder. And there's a few of them which are pretty interesting and probably will lead to some pretty creative possibilities. So let's just take a look through. So we're starting out on the default 13 preset because it's a pretty sensible one to start off with. And it sounds like this. Pretty generic kind of vocodery sound. Now we can tune this. So this is the carrier. So this is effectively a MIDI synth, which is inside this. So it's just a fairly simple synthesizer. You can hear the tuning there. Now we can mix some noise in with that. And you can imagine if you've got something where you've got voices you want to hear, then that noise is going to help that and make it sound a bit more like a breath. And modulation of that noise as well. Now pitch drift. You can hear the effect of that. And glide. So this is glide between notes. So if we put that to 100, I'll change notes. You can hear it slowly. So that's portamento. I don't think you need to finger it. You can hear. So sometimes portamento, the notes need to overlap. In this case, they don't. And if we turn the brightness down, so that's the brightness of the sort of main waveform, we can hear the noise much more. I'll turn that right down as well. So depending on the kind of sound you're after, this is going to be tunable in here. And then we've got the LFO rate. So if we put that down to about there. So we've got the LFO rate here. And then once we bring the vibrato up, we'll hear the effect. So we can hear that working. So we get sort of a wobbly tape machine up to true vibrato. And finally, bit of detune. So you've got some options there. Say it's not the most powerful synth in the world, but often than not in vocoders, they tend to be fairly simple and you don't want anything too complicated because it tends to get a bit lost, as we'll probably see a bit later on. Then on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got the modulator. So this is to do with how the signal that you are passing in this case, this vocal sample, is being controlled by this. So that's why these controls are different coloured. So we'll stick with this as it was in a fairly sane, pretty straightforward sound, and then play around with these. So the bandwidth control. So I think this is the width around each of these particular bands, because we can hear that's just thinning that out. So often you want to probably turn this up a fair bit. The minimum frequency, so this is a high pass filter. So there, only anything over 8K is coming through. So while these filters are opening up, there's not anything for them to let through other than the very highest stuff. So, and this will depend on what you're passing through. So if you're passing through something with more bass, then this will have a different effect. Then we've got maximum frequency. So it goes up to 8 kilohertz, but we can bring that down. So these two are just high pass and low pass filters. Okay, so now we come to something slightly more interesting. So first is the high through control. Now at the time of recording this, there's a bit of a problem with this. If you turn this up too much, you get a really nasty distorted signal. So I'm not going to do that. I know this is on the list of things that's going to get fixed, but if I turn this down, and then turn that back up, we're getting some of the original signal. So this is allowing a high frequency section of this to come through and be heard. So it's like the whispering. So you can often add some sort of clarity to the sound. You'll hear the original words more clearly if this comes through. But say if you turn it up too much, you'll get something pretty unpleasant. At this point, we've also got talk through. Talk is slightly strange. So when it's turned on, i.e. when the MIDI is playing, then it will let some of that whole signal through. So you can let that through if I'm playing. And as soon as I stop, it cuts out. But you can hear that more clearly. Now, gap through, I think is probably the most interesting part of this. When the MIDI is not being triggered, then it lets the original through. So you've got some interesting, there's a couple of presets to make use of this, but it's quite interesting because you can flick from the original automatically. So as I press that repeatedly, but it's just flicking from one to the other. But it's quite nice to have that, even at a low level, come through, and then get automatically turned off. So it's not just a mix control, which is quite nice. Now, emphasis. Let's take a listen to this. Now, you may be able to hear a little bit more. Go too far with this, you lose the sound, but somewhere around there, it's sounding a bit interplanetary like Beastie Boys. But so the relationship of the filters sounds like on here. And again, you have to remember with a lot of these two controls in particular will depend on the source material. So if you put something else through, it's going to sound different. Now, finally, the envelope speeds. This is how long it takes to kick in. So you see we've smoothed that out, whereas when it was... So the triggering of these, you can see it as well as hear it, but these are moving very quickly with the audio signal. But as we turn this speed, ironically, the speed up, it should be envelope time, really, I think. But you can see they're smoothed out, and you can hear that they're smoothed out, so it's not being anywhere near as choppy. And then that's just hold, so that will just stay on the particular setting they were on at the point. So once you've got that, you'd be able to just play it. As soon as I'm playing, even though there's no audio going through, we can just play that there. Not sure how useful that is or whether that will be kept once you restart, but certainly being able to smooth these out is the key to emulating particularly older sounding kind of vocoders. Finally, you've got input-output controls, which you've probably already seen. You can control the number of bands, so we can go to a 2-band. Which is probably too few. Up to 24. And you get a much more precise representation of what's there and everywhere in between. So, you know, a lot of classic vocoders, around sort of 12 bands, etc. And that, for the most part, is it. So it is possible to send external audio in. So if you think this synth is a bit boring, you can pick something else. But I find that although you would think this would work really well, I've never found with any of the vocoders I've played around with, when I've put in a great sounding synth, I've not really got a great sounding sound out. It's like there's too much going on. So the simplicity of the carrier side of this is actually useful. So in this case, I've got a Halion Sonic loaded up, and just on this kind of sound, it's one of the Anima presets, I believe, but you know, it's quite an interesting sound. and just feeding this into the vocoder. So what I'm going to do is just make sure that's set up. So you can see I've got the sidechain routing set up from Hallion Sonic. It's on a pre, so I can turn the channel down and not lose it. And then I turn this on here. Now, if I turn the volume down, so we're not going to hear the Hallion Sonic, we play that. We get... It's like we're not really getting the original. And even if we go to 24 bands, so it's always been slightly disappointing to say that's okay, and we've got this nice mix of the two. You can play around with the gap, etc. I was doing something earlier where we have the MIDI on, and then when you play it, you get the synth note, and when you don't play it, you get the sound via gap through, etc. So you can get some interesting mixes between sounds because this has got some useful controls in there, which not everyone has. But ultimately, I think it's best being triggered from the internal carrier. I always had this thought that drum loops would work really well with a vocoder. I'm yet to find one that does, but overall, I think this is a pretty good vocoder. It's certainly as good as any other one that I've played around with. Vocoders seem to come and go in fashion, every 15 to 20 years or so. So I guess they're due for another resurgence, are they? I'm not sure. Fashion probably isn't really my thing. But anyway, if they come back round, you'll be able to dial up the Steinberg vocoder and get started straight away. As ever, I hope you found this video useful, and we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.